have a period of meditation, maybe about a half hour or so. Then I'm going to share installment one of the four-part series on more or less on self. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some conversation about that engrossing topic. If you've sat with me before, you know that one of the things I'm working on in my life is transitions, and especially the transition between the activity and busyness of daily life and then coming into stillness for meditation. Uh, Ways to just facilitate that arriving normally when I'm going about my world. Sometimes, I'm actually sort of rushing to get here, and so then come with that energy, and it's like, wow, like I'm running around to get somewhere to sit and do nothing. So what facilitates that transition? And many things, but one of the things that is my favorite is sound. Like so we'll do a somatic experiencing exercise that revolves around sound. And um, many of you have done this with me before. The way it works is you take a deep breath, about as deep as you can take a breath. You make something that more or less sounds like the sound of a foghorn. I'll demonstrate that. And then because we all will need to take another breath at a different time, the sound should just hang in the air. And because this is a place where we train the awareness, you can let your awareness rest on the parts of the body that are vibrating or in resonance with the sound. And I'll ring this bell, and then we can have whatever breath we're on, wherever we are in the breath, be the last breath to come into silence. Just notice before we start, how's the sense of energy in the body in this moment? And then when we're done, I'll invite the same reflection after a little bit of silence. So it sounds more or less like this. Noticing if there's any difference. And letting the awareness penetrate the body to connect with whatever sensations might be present. Tingling or vibration, whatever it might be. And see if you can have some sense of the attitude of mind, the mood of the mind. thing that's coloring how you're meeting this moment? And then on an exhale breath, inviting the body to soften. Any part of the body where there's tension or holding can just soften. Letting go of anything extra. And noticing for a moment that you're connected indirectly, but connected to the earth. You can feel the earth element and the hardness of the floor, hardness of the chair. Sensing in to feel the weight of the body in your feet and in your seat. And again, softening, allowing yourself to be fully supported. And then resting the awareness on the feeling of the breath, moving in and out of the body. And letting all other experience more or less fade into the background. And simplifying our mode of engaging with the world, all its complexity, to the simplicity of breathing in, aware of the in-breath, breathing out, aware of the out-breath. And as you continue to soften the body, inviting some softening in the mind. Half smile of the Buddha never fails to soften. Or even some sense of an inner smile. Breathing in, knowing, feeling, sensing the in-breath. Breathing out, knowing, feeling, sensing the out-breath. Letting go of any agenda, not trying to make anything happen, just allowing the practice to be restful. Just creating some space for whatever activations or energies are present to naturally settle down on their own. Helpful, you can use an inner sound, something like in and out. I use the mantra Buddho. So Bu, the inhale, Do, the exhale. Just giving another little hook for the mind to rest. The inner vibrations have a quality of being relaxing, settling. And every time you notice that the attention has wandered from the breath, it's not a problem. It's the nature of the mind to wander. And in this moment of recognition, you've already come back. Letting the attention rest on the felt sense of this breathing body. And if there are strong energies, sensations, or emotions that are reluctant to stay in the background, calling for your attention, and you can invite them into the field of awareness, maybe with a sense of breathing with or breathing through. The energy of the breath mixing and mingling with the energy of this experience in a way that softens. Just re-establishing the breath as the center point of awareness as many times as is needed without any judgment. Just inviting a steady, gentle, patient effort. As we continue this process of arriving more fully into this body, into this moment, you might tune in to more subtle occurrences of the breath. Maybe some movement at the neck or the shoulders. Maybe some movement at the back of the body. Maybe air at the nose or the upper lip, which is often quite subtle. Maybe even sometimes feeling the coolness of the inhale and the warmth of the exhale. And then continuing to connect with the experience of breathing wherever it's most pleasant, most available. And as you feel the sensations of the breathing body, maybe dropping in a question, not to figure it out, just to see what emerges. Who is feeling? Who is feeling? and letting go of that practice and bringing to mind someone or something that you are grateful for. If it's a person or some being, you might sense into what it's like to be in their presence, or visualizing some situation in your mind's eye as best you're able. And then connecting with gratitude as a feeling in the body. Noticing where gratitude resides in the body, and sensing into what it feels like. Usually quite pleasant. You can savor the goodness of a moment of gratitude. The experience of gratitude have a shape with some boundary. And if it does, maybe inviting that experience of gratitude to expand, to pervade more and more of the body. And maybe even allowing the inner smile of gratitude to creep outward even to the slightest expression. Tiny curling of the corners of the mouth upward. So in a moment, I'll ring the bell 3 times to indicate the transition. And see if you can maintain the same quality of presence, same quality of attentiveness. Just moving the body around in any way that feels supportive. One of my favorite quotes from the Buddha. Through many births, I have wandered on and on, searching for, but never finding the builder of this house. To be born again and again is suffering. House builder, you are seen. You will not build the house again. All the rafters are broken, the ridgepole is destroyed, the mind gone to the unconstructed has reached the end of craving. So it's an experiment of sorts. Um, uh, Spend these next tonight and the following 3 Wednesdays exploring the terrain of the self, uh, the Buddha called not self, and It's a subtle teaching. It's not something that is necessarily intuitive or readily apparent. I've been sort of exploring this terrain for some time now and still feel like I'm just starting to get a sense of uh, how valuable this is, how important it is, how it can inform the way we live our lives. It it risks going into the territory of philosophical. As you'll see, the Buddha was very aware of this and um, often steered people back into the practical. Um, so I'm going to follow just sort of the thread of that, and along the way, we will encounter many things, the teachings that the Buddha oriented people to in lieu of asking theoretical, philosophical questions, and what the Buddha actually said about the self and how he explained what he was saying about the self. Um, I'll talk about self and not self as different kinds of perceptions and how these perceptions are useful, both of them in their own way, different ways of seeing the same reality. Um, and then I'll talk about probably the most interesting will come at the end, the activities of the mind that create the sense of self. And with the sense of self comes dukkha, suffering, stress, reactivity, sorrow, lamentation, grief, all the things that this path is built to tackle in our lives. So the Buddha used this word anatta. Anatta gets translated in a lot of different ways. Um, you will hear people say there is no self, self is an illusion, be the teaching of no self. Sometimes it's translated as not self. And this is just on its face very counterintuitive because, like, I mean, I certainly feel like I'm a me and all of you are you. And um, when I have an itch, I don't scratch your cheek, I scratch my cheek. There seems to be a boundedness to this experience. So it's kind of baffling when somebody says, there is no self. And I'm going to try to untangle that uh, bafflement, if that's a word. And what's being pointed to here, and I'll use the term not self, what's pointed to here in not self is not so much something that you should believe or have to believe or a view you need to adopt, but actually a signpost for something that we can see in our own meditative experience. It's an insight to be revealed through practice is actually one of the big classical insights. This is Insight LA, and the insight refers to um, three classical insights that arise in the practice of meditation that are liberative. They give us a sense of they are freeing. They lighten the load that we carry in the world. And this will be a through line of this whole discussion, but I'll just mention them briefly here and we'll explore them in a little more detail. So the three insights are the insight into dukkha, anicca, and anatta. Dukkha, usually translated as suffering, but it's the range of like just not quite right to like what we might really call a kind of the suffering of war and trauma and um, sickness. Sometimes translated as unsatisfactoriness in the way that you can't really plant a flag on something in a way that will give you a reliable, lasting sense of well-being, happiness, security, sense of belonging. safety, whatever it is we're kind of seeking out of practice. So the insight is that all conditioned phenomena, so all things, for all practical purpose, all things are unsatisfactory. And then the insight into anicca, inconstancy, impermanence, all things are in flux. The world appears often to be very solid and stable, but when we look much more closely, we can see that that almost everything is a process. Now, even this body, which has some structure to it, you know, the cells are always changing. I forget the statistic. It's like every 7 years, basically most of your cells have been replaced. So what appears to be solid and stable is actually a process. Buddha observes this about the whole world. Everything is process. And anatta, not self, that all conditioned phenomena, all things are empty of any sense of self. And in essence, the whole 4 week class is going to be about that. So I'll just leave it at that to begin. Um, let's just say there's a lot of, as they say in Zen, there's a lot of fingers pointing at the moon. So um, one good way to listen to these kinds of teaching is to just let the words kind of flow over you and see what sticks and what doesn't, and not try to hang on to every word or every concept. So what did the Buddha say about the self? So there's a story in the collection of stories of the Buddha where a wanderer came to see the Buddha, the wanderer Vacchagotta. He's kind of a recurring character. He shows up from time to time. And they go through the formalities, very polite society. So there's like a bowing and a circumambulation and a sitting to one side. And then he just goes right into it. He asks the Buddha, is there a self? And the Buddha was silent. And he says, is there not self? And the Buddha was silent. And then Vacchagotta gets up and leaves. Sort of like a very uh interesting but uneventful story. Nothing really happens. And so Ananda, who is the Buddha's chief of staff, who's the gatekeeper of the Buddha's schedule and who would get an audience with the Buddha, and he was at every teaching. It said that he had an amazing memory, and he's the person that committed to memory all of the teachings. Um, so he asked the Buddha, how come you didn't answer this guy? And Buddha said, if I were to say that there's a self, this would be inconsistent with my teaching that all phenomena are empty of self. Um, there's like self is like a characteristic, like wetness is a characteristic of water. The Buddha is saying that all phenomena are empty of this characteristic of self. Um, if I say there is no self, the Buddha said, then Vacchagotta would become even more confused. He'll say, does the self I used to have now not exist? So it's acknowledging that we kind of go through the world feeling like I'm a me, I'm a, I have a self. And if somebody would say there is no self, that would also be confusing. There's a sort of like conventional reality in which we operate where we have a sense of self, we have a personality, we have a driver's license, maybe we have a social security number. Um, so the Buddha says a position is something that the Buddha referred to himself as the Tathagata. A position is something that the Tathagata has done away with. He's saying that this is basically to take a position on this is a philosophical quagmire. He said it would lead to a false belief, a jungle of false beliefs, a desert of false beliefs, a thorny spike of false beliefs, an agitation of false beliefs, and a fetter of false beliefs. He's really trying to drive home the how this is not useful. Uh, so the Buddha never said there is no self. In fact, he wouldn't take a position on this. Uh, Bhikkhu Bodhi, the scholar monk, says, there is no self as the granddaddy of all fake Buddhist quotes. It has a kind of superficial resemblance to the teachings, but it's not exactly accurate. Another story, that someone goes to the Buddha and is asking these kind of esoteric questions. He's asking about the cosmos. Is the cosmos infinite? Is the cosmos finite? Is the body and the soul the same thing? Um, what happens to a Buddha after death? Does a Buddha exist? Does the Buddha not exist? Does the Buddha both exist and not exist, or neither exist nor not exist? These sort of philosophical questions. And this person is actually saying, you got to tell me these things, or I'm going to leave this place. And if you don't know, just tell me you don't know. But the silence is killing me, basically. And I love what he says. He says, if you don't tell me, I'm going to go back to the low life. And the first time I heard this, I was thinking, wow, that's a strange way to refer to your family. I'm going back to the low life. But he's actually talking about the lower life, like leaving the holy life to go back to mundane householder living. So the Buddha gives them an analogy for this kind of questioning or this kind of position. He says, if a man were wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and his friends brought him a surgeon, to take out the arrow and heal the poison. But the man would say, I won't have this arrow removed until I know whether the person who wounded me was a noble, a Brahmin, a merchant, or worker. I won't have this arrow removed until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, until I know whether he was tall, medium, or short, until I know his complexion, until I know his town, his village, what kind of bow it was, what was the fiber, was it bamboo, sinew, hemp, or bark? And he goes on and on through all these kinds of things that he wants to know before he will allow the surgeon to heal the wound. But as pointing out the absurdity of this line of philosophical questions is that they don't actually lead to the solving of the underlying problem, which is how do we free ourselves from distress, lamentation, sorrow. There's a bunch of things that the Buddha says he won't declare. So he doesn't say this, but he actually won't declare whether there's a self or whether there's not self. He won't declare whether the cosmos is finite or infinite, whether the soul and body are the same or different, what happens to a Buddha after death. But then he says, uh, what is declared by me? This is stress. It's declared by me. This is the origin of stress. This is declared by me. This is the cessation of stress, declared by me. This is the path leading to the cessation of stress, declared by me. So this is the seminal teaching of the Buddha. Yeah. The rendering of the Four Noble Truths. It's the heart of this whole endeavor. It informs can inform every moment of meditative practice. And it's something like there is stress, another word for dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, this realization that the Buddha had in his meditation that, wow, this realm of human existence is characterized by this. Um, and when I first heard these words, it was quite relieving because I had been operating under the premise that whenever I was having a moment of distress or discontent or suffering, that it was something that it was a mistake. I hadn't executed some strategy correctly, or it was some personal failing. Um, and now the Buddha comes along and, or I get exposed to the Buddha having said 2,500 years ago, essentially some version of that suffering is not a bug, it's a feature. And it's a feature because it becomes our motivation and our fulcrum to cultivate a path of practice to free ourselves from that experience. So there is suffering, sometimes rendered that way, and that's the insight. And then there's a practice instruction, and the practice instruction is suffering is to be known. And this is what you hear, you know, any kind of meditation class you take, any kind of Dharma study program you take. The instructions in insight meditation, Vipassana meditation, are often to turn towards what is difficult, what's painful, what's distressing. Turn towards, it's very counterintuitive, actually. Like, uh, my background is as a corporate lawyer. I'm in spaces with lawyers, often teaching meditation. I just spent a whole day last week with 61 lawyers at Spirit Rock practicing meditation. And people will say, why on earth would I want more of that afflictive experience? Like gonna run the other way. Um, it's counterintuitive. To some sense, it's instinctual. Like as animals, we run away from pain, we move towards pleasure. It's kind of how we're built. And it's adaptive because it keeps us alive, keeps us out of danger. It only makes sense when you examine the alternative. And the alternative is some form of resistance. And if we're not moving toward something to explore it, to investigate it, almost by definition, we're resisting it in some way. That resistance might be a denial or distraction, but there's some resistance. That resistance causes a kind of agitation in the system. Many of us live in this field of agitation that comes from the unwillingness or inability, you have to build up this capacity to turn towards what's difficult. But something ineffable happens when we turn towards what's difficult as we begin to understand how our suffering is constructed. So this is stress. This is the origin of stress. The origin of stress, the Buddha says, is clinging and aversion. That sometimes it's rendered as like a thorn in the heart. There's something, and then sometimes it's like subtle and hard to see. And then we don't see that we're in contention with something, or holding on to something for dear life, or pushing something away, racing against. And when we're bracing against, we're kind of like creating the tension that we then experience in our life as tension. So our suffering is caused by this habit of clinging and aversion. And the Buddha says this is the cessation of stress. So the cessation of stress is possible. And then there's a whole path beyond the scope of this talk, a whole eightfold path of various ways to use our attention, to use our energy to um, free ourselves from this cycle of suffering. And the Buddha says, and why are these declared by me? It's reminding us because they're connected with the goal. They're foundational to, he calls it holy life. I'd say a life inspired by practice and cultivation. Uh, this leads to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, calming, direct knowledge, self-awakening, unbinding. This is why they're declared by me. So, little detour from the self, but back to the notion of self. Like, what do we even mean by self, or what did the Buddha mean um, when he wouldn't take a position on whether there is a self, but when he said that all phenomenon are empty of the characteristic of self? Um, and we can infer a lot of this from the way the Buddha spoke, and also by just looking at the context of that time, the prevailing religious and spiritual practices of that time, and still today, actually, in many places. Um, the notion of a self as something that's eternal and unchanging, some like seed of essence of something. And at the time and today, in many sort of Brahmanic, Vedic, we'd say Hindu-ish religions, um, the fruition of the spiritual path is seen as discovery of this eternal, unchanging self and some kind of unity with that self. And it's like that's the fruition of the practice, and with that comes great joy. And there's some sense that this, they call it Atman, Atta, so the self, and then anatta is not self, is kind of a locus of control. It's like the pilot in the cockpit that's kind of calling the shots. And some people would say this uh, capital S self is identical to the universe itself, or to God, to a creator. And some of this is, kind of, I think, maps on to the intuitive sense of self. Like most people report, and I certainly have a sense of myself, which seems more or less unchanged. Like for as long as I can remember, the sense of what it is to be me, although the body changes and the circumstances change, there is some feeling of me-ness that seems unchanging. This sense of what it is to be me going through the world. Um, we make decisions, we make choices, we do things in the world that creates this sort of intuitive sense of control. Like, I mean, intellectually, we know we don't control everything, but there is a sense of like I'm in the driver's seat of my life, more or less. Maybe there are habits or patterns that are hard to overcome, but some sense of agency and autonomy that kind of comports with this like sense of self. And when we have that sense of agency and self-determination, there is a kind of joy, there's a kind of happiness to being a me, being a person. Um, so maybe the intuitive sense of how we experience this maps on somewhat to what the Buddha was talking about. So the Buddha wouldn't take a position on the existence or non-existence of the self. Um, in many things, he wouldn't take a position on existence, but he would talk more in terms of causation. Um, things arising according to conditions and causes. And this is very helpful because this is, another version of what happens in our exploration of how we construct our suffering. We see the conditions that lead to suffering, and then we do our best to change those decisions. Um, I was in a day-long on Saturday, day-long meditation retreat, and the theme was tranquility meditation. So um, we set out to create the conditions that lead to tranquility. And so that's like being in noble silence, having a whole day with nothing to do with practice, having a kind of steadiness of our attention on a particular object rather than mind moving around a lot. Um, and then one of the things I invited people to consider, and you can feel after we started at 10, we came back into conversation at 3, so hour for lunch, 4 hours of continuous meditation, you can actually feel like some settling of the psyche, some coming into tranquility. But it's not sufficient. It's also really helpful to pay attention to how we're using our mind, what we're being exposed to in the periods where we're not meditating. So the exploration I had people do is like, what are the conditions in your life? What are the activities that you engage in that cause agitation? And, there's no shortage of that. You ask that question to yourself, you can think of all the things that are agitating. Um, the New York Times is probably my favorite highly agitating diversion. Um, and then you can examine like which of these things that are agitating are optional. And we may have agitation in things that we're committed to in our work or people that we're committed to for various reasons. But what are the things that where we have agency to do fewer things that are agitating? This is looking at conditions. What are the conditions that cause agitation? Or what are the things that cause a sense of calm? Or what are activities or ways of engagement that are calming? And we can kind of list these out and contemplate them, and then which are more available. Like, can I prioritize some of these? Can I spend more time in doing these things? So I share that just as a way of like contextualizing how this is very practical when we look at conditions. What are the conditions that lead to my own well-being, the well-being of others around me? What are the conditions that lead to affliction for myself and others around me? Less concerned with some description of reality, but more concerned with the process that keeps us entangled and the process that frees us. This is like a classic example that's given is, does this fist exist? And as soon as you say it exists, I'm going to open my hand. And where did the fist go? Like, in a way, the fist wasn't really a thing unto itself. It's just a collection of conditions of the hand curling inward, fingers pointing at the palm. And there's a story of in the Buddha of a nun who's meditating, and Mara, who's this mischievous figure in the Buddha's world. He's sort of like not quite the devil, and since he's not like so like malevolent or evil, but he's like mischievous and also trying to derail everyone from their practice. Sometimes he's rendered as the embodiment of greed, hatred, and delusion. So this nun is meditating, and Mara appears and is trying to um, have her fall out of concentration or distract her in some way. So Mara asks these questions. By whom has this being been created? Who is the maker of this being? Where has this being arisen? Where does this being cease? He's talking about to the nun, who are you? Who have you been created? Who's the maker of this being? And then the nun replied to him in verse. It says, why now do you assume a being? Mara, have you grasped a view? That's back to the thicket of views, the thorny fetter of views. This is a heap of sheer constructions. Here no being is found. And then the key analogy. Just as with an assemblage of parts, the word chariot is used. So when the aggregates are present, there is a convention of a being. So I'll talk about the aggregates next time, but the analogy that's often used for this discussion is that of a chariot. So if you look at a chariot, we could modernize. We could say you look at a car, you know, where is the essential essence of the car? You know, if I take out the steering wheel, is it still a car? Well, probably because we have all these cars driving around with no driver. Um, and I'm sure there's an analogy to be made about not self there. If I take the wheels off, is it still a car? If I take out the engine or the motor, if I take out the upholstery, you can't really find any particular component within the car that's the essential essence of the car. The carness of the car is nowhere to be found. So the word chariot is a concept. It's a conceptual overlay on a set of conditions. That's very useful and convenient. I can say the word car and you know exactly what I'm talking about. But we could also say that the car is empty of any inherent essence. It's empty of any inherent existence because you can't point to the carness of the car. Uh, and as we'll see next week, the Buddha had a similar analogy for this human being, just a preview that the Buddha described the experience of being a person as a series of these five aggregates, these five processes, um, form, feeling, perception, uh, formations, and consciousness. And then we can do a similar analysis, which we'll do next week, to tease apart how all these things are also empty of any inherent sense of self. And I'm going to get to this later, but just to preview, like the whenever there's a sense of self, there's a sense of suffering. So you think about a moment, for me, it's often in nature or solitude, a moment hiking in the woods where it's peaceful and beautiful, or a moment at a vista of a panoramic view or a sunset, or a moment of profound intimate connection with another human or animal being, that the sense of self gets quite diminished. We're not so self-centered. We're not so self-preoccupied. We're not uh, engaged in the sort of ongoing task that we live our life of, like trying to orient the self and keep the self safe and assess the self. How am I doing? Do they like me? Do they not like me? Am I fitting in? All the things that we just naturally do as human beings in relationship uh, fall away. I'm sure we've all had some version of this experience, and that's a moment of profound peace and contentment. And the Buddha is pointing to some version of that we can cultivate in our own life and our own way of engaging with this life. And you contrast that with a moment where someone disagrees with you or someone criticizes you. And it's like this beast gets unleashed. Um, and it comes with a lot of distress. Something is being clung to, something is being protected, something is, a feeling of being attacked. And That's not a pleasant experience. It's not a peaceful way to go through the world with this beast is showing its fangs all the time. Maybe the last thing I'll say is that, with the sense of self comes idea of some ownership, my body, my thoughts, my emotions, my life. And there's a way in which that's true. Thoughts that I have, this mind body system are different than the thoughts you have in all your body system. But I recently had a chance to spend time with a young, I don't know how young, she's Asian, so I can't really tell how young she is. She's a Dharma teacher who practiced in the uh, Burmese meditation tradition. And she was telling a story of going to her master, the Sayadaw in Burma, and she had been off and on and on, but she was just coming out of lay life, and she's saying, my life is a mess. She just had this breakup, and I don't have any money, and I can't find a job. My life is a mess. What do I do? My life's a mess. And the Sayadaw, the teacher, just said, "It's not your life." And that was very helpful for her. So it's pointing to something where there can be a sense of like these things are happening, but they're not as self-defining as we usually take them to be.